Authentication is a crucial part of most web applications. Normally, you'll have some subset of routes that you want to be restricted to certain users only. Hapi supports authentication in a very flexible way through its plugin system. There's lots of auth plugins available. Some of them are published by the Hapi organization itself, and then there's lots and lots of community contributions. The reason there's so many is that there's so many different ways to do auth on the web. Each of the different ways to handle authentication we call an auth scheme in Hapi. I'm going to cover authentication in a few different videos, but I'm going to start with arguably the simplest scheme in this video, which is basic authentication. If you've seen modal windows like this before when you're trying to access pages on the web, then you've come up against basic auth before. Basic auth is neither the most fashionable nor secure way of doing auth, and I probably wouldn't recommend it for anything serious. However, it's a great introduction to auth because it takes very little time to get set up. I'm going to build on the blog project from the previous video. First, I'm going to create a new route to /restricted. This route will render the restricted.hbs template. I'm going to create the template and add some minimal text. Then I'm going to add a new link into the layout nav to this page. The page is public right now, so we can browse to it, but this is a route that we're going to add basic auth to. The first step is to install Hapi Auth Basic. Then we're going to want to register that with server.register. So I mentioned schemes before. There's also another concept to Hapi authentication. Before you can apply auth to a route, you create what's called a strategy. So a strategy is essentially a named instance of a scheme. This confuses people, but actually it's very simple. I find a good way to think of it is to think of a scheme as if it's a class, say basic auth, and then a strategy is just an instance of that class. So you can create many strategies from a single scheme. We create the strategy by calling server.auth.strategy and passing 3 arguments. The first is the name that you want to call your strategy. I'll go with restricted. The second argument is the name of the scheme. The Hapi Auth Basic plugin has registered the basic scheme, so we just use basic here. Last but not least, a set of options we pass to Hapi Auth Basic. There's only one required option here, which is a function called validate. For this, we're going to define an async function taking 3 arguments. The request, which is the request object for the request attempting to authenticate, and username and password, which are fairly self-explanatory. So it's inside this function where we look at the username and password supplied by the request and decide if it matches any known user. So you might have noticed that we're missing something vital here. We don't actually have any users. Let's make a users.json file in our data directory. Let's make this an object keyed by the username. The properties I'm going to include for the user are their username, password, and full name. Let's load this file now in the index.js file, and we can get back to writing validate. This function should return an object with 2 properties. Is valid, which should be a boolean, so it's true if the auth attempt was successful and false if not. The second property is credentials, which is optional. This is an object containing information about your user, and we'll see how that's useful later. First, we want to check if the user maps to a real user that we know about. If it doesn't, we can return immediately with isValidFalse. The next thing we want to check is if the password was correct. So we can compare the password given in the request to the password that we have in the users.json file. And again, if it doesn't match, we return isValidFalse. So if we got this far, then we know that the user must be valid. So we can return isValidTrue and set credentials as the user object. So now we've created the strategy, we need to use it. On our restricted route, let's set an option. We create an options object and set the auth property to the name of the strategy that we just created. Let's try and load the root now. There's the authentication modal that we're expecting. I'll type in username Matt and password secret, and we're in. If I reload the page, it still works. That's because the browser's caching the username and password for the lifetime of the session. In our handler, we can access the credentials that we set before and validate with request.auth.credentials. Let's pass that into our view context. We can now print out a more appropriate welcome message to the user. Before the end of this tutorial, I want to address something else. We've made a schoolboy error here because we've stored our password in plain text. I'm not going to go into why this is a terrible idea, but a simple Google search will yield many good resources. To address this, I'm going to use the bcrypt package. Bcrypt is a popular password hashing function. Let's install and register bcrypt. I want to convert our password into a hash using bcrypt. I'm going to do this with a one-liner in the terminal. I'll take this hash and replace our password in the users.json file. All that's left to do now is replace the equality check that we have in the validate function with a call to bcrypt.compare, passing in the provided password and the user hash as arguments. This is an async call because behind the scenes bcrypt is making use of a thread pool, so we'll want to prefix the call with await. Let's start a new browser session and try again. Everything seems to be working well. We've successfully ridden ourselves of storing plain text passwords. As a final note, I want to point out that even though we're not storing plain text passwords anymore, HTTP Basic Auth doesn't provide any kind of encryption by default. So your browser is sending your credentials in plain text over the network to the server. If you do decide to go with Basic Auth, I strongly advise you to serve your pages only over SSL. In a future video, I'm going to go into SSL more.